Please. Everybody, if I am a little awkward, I seem to have been very clumsy and injured a leg. So it has got nothing to do with my audience, it is my entire responsibility. But Mr. Vice Chancellor, as I said, you have given a fantastic background without having seen me, unless secretly you have seen me, to what I hope to present to this audience. Professor Bose, thank you for being here. Members of the faculty, students, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed conscious of the privilege that you have extended to me by inviting me to speak at this prestigious institution. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming here.
There are several other reasons for which I am grateful to NUJS. I am aware of the high standards of learning that have made the NUJS one of the best recognized and evaluated national law colleges in the country, and I dare say internationally. I have a paradoxical feeling of being, on the one hand, overwhelmed by the talent, both current and potential, facing me today, and on the other, a feeling of affinity with the students, as many years ago, I too was a student in this city. Of course, it was then Calcutta University. So even though I have spent much of my life away from this city, there is a feeling of homecoming, for which too I thank you. And the warmth of my welcome and very prompt assistance extended to me by the young students who have organized this meeting, deeply appreciated. The subject, and I was given the choice of choosing the subject, provided I kept it general. I think that was correct, Pranav. The subject I have chosen is India's multilateral diplomacy, the challenges of global governance. This requires, in my view, some clarifications and definitions of the terms as used by me in my presentation, drawing briefly on historical facts to emphasize the focal point of my argument. I have frequently found this helpful, not only in developing my own thoughts, but in presenting them as logically as possible to my audiences. I would therefore ask for your indulgence in the event I seem to clarify what to many of you may seem basic, self-evident or obvious. I will then spend some time in attempting to describe the present global situation impacting on global governance, and finally end with outlining what I believe are the challenges facing Indian multilateral diplomacy in a rapidly changing world. Diplomacy has been identified as how foreign policy is conducted. I would add to that, it is the tool that nations use to protect and project its national interests, security, economic and political, on which foreign policy itself is based. If I might go back a bit in history, which is a discipline on which diplomacy relies to a very large extent, together with law. In ancient times, diplomacy was conducted mainly bilaterally, with one's immediate neighbors or with our neighbor's neighbor, as prescribed by Chanakya in the Arthashastra, on issues of trade, but more often on territorial disputes and power projection for economic benefit. It is interesting to note that even today, bilateral diplomacy is the most frequently preferred forum to discuss issues relating to security and disputes, territorial or otherwise. I mean, it just comes to mind, I was watching television this morning to see that when Russia and the US agreed, a Security Council resolution was adopted on Syria. Bilaterally, even though it's a multilateral issue, it needed the agreement of two countries for it to proceed. Of course, alliances were formed and with multiple partners to defeat a common enemy at a given point in time. But these alliances were shifting ones as the perception of the enemy changed. If we look at our own history, up to the onset of colonialism or the history of the warring countries of Europe, which even fought some of their war in their colonies, the instability of alliances could be traced to perceptions of national interest at a given point in time. Diplomacy, therefore, was traditionally, it is not anymore, intertwined with issues of war and security. Multilateral diplomacy, on the other hand, in its present forms, appeared with the formation of the United Nations in 1945, and that too as the evolution of an alliance formed during World War II. The precursor of the UN was the ill-fated League of Nations set up by the Allies after World War I. But given the fact that decolonization had not yet taken place, the League of Nations was not a truly representative body, and India participated, but as a part of the British Empire. The only attempt at decolonization was with the colonies of the defeated powers, the Ottoman Empire and German colonies. I make this point because of the tendency of the victors to decide on the defeated. A primitive thing, but this is all 20th century, hardly ancient history. These colonies, the Ottoman and German ones, were made into mandates to be governed by the victorious powers, presaging some of the world's most intractable problems in, for example, West Asia. It did, however, establish some of the institutions that later became a part of the UN system, and it also laid down some of the practices that were to be adapted by the UN. In fact, it was perhaps the first time in the League of Nations that international relations were sought to be institutionalized. An attempt was made to set up a global order reflecting the power dispositions of the time. The origins of the UN itself also, of course, deserve a brief reference, as I believe the foundations of global governance as it exists today were laid at that time. The name the United Nations, as you are aware, was a product of World War II, yet another product of war, and was selected by the US President to describe the wartime alliance of countries which were fighting against the alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan. These were the Allied forces. They were called the United Nations. With the victory of the former, led by the United States, the victors, once again, decided to shape a successor to the League of Nations, which had all but collapsed. In 1945, the United Nations, as we now know it, came into being with the participation of about 56 countries. India participated, but still as a colony of Britain, just as several colonies of the Soviet Union also did, Ukraine and Belarusia, for example. China, as a victorious power against Japan, was represented by the Republic of China. It was not until 1973 that the People's Republic took over China's seat. Global power at that time rested with the United States and the USSR, and on the exhausted colonial powers, UK and France. The UN Charter, however, was not concerned only with issues of war and peace. of politics and security, but a vast swathe of international behavior, which the Vice Chancellor referred to, and interaction, economic, social, and legal. The first international specialized agency to be amalgamated into the evolving system was the International Labour Organization. Today there are agencies which include UNESCO, FAO, WHO, ITU, you name it, WMO, it's across the world. There's even a World Tourist Organization. Each of these agency structures reflects that of the UN itself, which had kept, the UN kept issues relating to international peace and security with the UN Security Council, where the victors of World War II were permanent members. What was also kept out of the ambit of the UN family, as it were the issues relating to international trade and commerce, first with GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and international money and finance. So you have the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank, of course, was initially set up to fund the reconstruction of war-devastated Germany. These institutions were set up with much tighter control of decision-making by the three countries who were victors: the UK, France, and of course the US, with the exclusion of the defeated countries of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the communist countries, reflecting the realities of the now burgeoning Cold War. These three countries, therefore, were able to set the outlines of both the practices inheriting much from a common European history and the defunct League of Nations, and structures, both practices and structures, which over time evolved into systems of global governance. A very perceptive French economist, you may have heard of him, Piketty, has pointed out in another context, the control of structures results in the control of a system, the global order in fact. Before turning to the much more complex definition of global governance, let me hasten to add two caveats. One, if I have given an impression of adverse criticism of this order, that has not been my intention. I have merely tried to describe the facts underlying the current global order, which is now under challenge. India has been and continues to be a staunch supporter of these agencies and of this order. Oh God, I beg your pardon. What do I do with this? I'm sorry, this phone makes me very unsmart. There's no point giving a smartphone to a person of my generation. I'm sorry, I'm speaking for myself. So I don't mean to adversely criticize the this order. I'm just trying to describe it because India has benefited from this order and has contributed extensively to it. I feel it necessary to emphasize these historical points to bring into context the reaction which is now taking place to in the 21st century by the established powers, the three leading states of the West. The second caveat, the impact of the Cold War was felt in the UN by the newly independent countries like India, decolonization being one of the greatest achievements of the UN, which rallied international support for national efforts towards freedom from colonial rule. This permitted more and more countries to join the UN as sovereign nation states. Non-alignment or freedom of decision-making for these countries was one of the major substantive results, with countries such as India, Egypt, Yugoslavia and Ghana leading the way. While these countries, certainly alone, but even together, did not at the time have the power to influence decisions being taken by the UN in their name by the established powers, they attempted to act as a pressure group and encouraged other newly independent members of the UN to take decisions on global issues in their own perceived interests. Today there are 193 members of the UN. Discussions in these multilateral forums, it must be mentioned, were and are conducted in groups, regional, like-minded, ideological, issue-based. You look at the climate change negotiations, you had over 190 countries, but it was groups which, looking after their own interests from whichever angle, not necessarily climate change, those resisting the changes being brought to the existing order through climate change negotiations, formed their own group, it's called the umbrella group. Therefore, in a sense, as the pillars of global governance were gradually established, it was with the participation of all members, but led and shaped by the established powers in their interests as they retained the positions they had occupied in 1945. The term global governance, please do not confuse this with global government. It is not a single government who will govern the world, nor is it good governance, because global governance has frequently not been good. This term was initially used by academics in the West, particularly in the US, from about the mid-1990s, around the time when academic, if not political attention began to be focused on the rise of China and other emerging markets. It was generally taken to cover the various regimes that were and continue to be established in the field of human rights, the labor conditions, to international trade and finance, non-proliferation and climate change, and partially even to terrorism. In 1995, US political scientist called Finkelstein widened the definition of global governance he widened it, but accepted that it was any purposeful activity intended to control or influence someone else, that is another nation state, or project influence into that area. He widened it to say that there are overlapping categories of functions performed internationally among nation states: information creation and exchange, formulation and promulgation of principles and promotion of consensual knowledge affecting the general international order, regional orders, particular issues on the international agenda, and efforts to influence the domestic rules and behavior of states. You have mediation and the compulsory resolution of disputes. And just note the adjectives which are used in his thing. I will skip the details of this. He defined global governance to the activities of the institutions without identifying the political drivers behind the institutions, and therefore the activities, and therefore the power, where the power lay. At the risk of being charged with impropriety, I'm going to quote for myself. I do apologize. But I gave my definition of global governance in an international journal for which I wrote in 2010. But I think that my definition is clearer than Finkelstein's. And this is what I had said in that article. The term global governance has been used to denote variously the power and reach of multilateral institutions, the rules and norms set by them, the right of mainly Western civil society organizations to participate in global decision-making in a kind of post-Westphalian world, where the writ of the nation-state is, on occasion, superseded by a global norm, and in extreme cases, by agendas drawn up by the powerful on issues of importance to them, to be negotiated with the participation of all countries on the grounds of a greater public good. As, for example, the case of non-proliferation, international trade, and climate change was for public good. I mean, all of you who've been following the debates would have heard this term being used all the time from the West, denying what they have done to the climate for 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, leaving less space in the carbon budget for those who are growing today. This was and continues to define the structures, principles, and practices of global governance today. However, I come to now the global situation. As the UN celebrated 70 years of its existence this year, what was immediately apparent was not only the great changes that have taken place in the power centers in the world, but the rapidity of the change, particularly in the last decades of the 20th and the first decades of the current century. The changes have encompassed the political, economic, and social spheres, and while they also affected the stability that the global order had offered, enabling and even encouraging the changes, there is little to indicate the future shape that any new order might take, a completely new basis for a new global order, or an adaptation of the existing order with a mere change of leadership. The major changes in the 70-year period, in my view, include the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a nationalistic Russia, and a triumphalist West, the rise of China, the gradual political decline of power projection and capabilities of Western Europe, and of course the unleashing of the forces of globalization, affecting all nations in all spheres, from the global economy, financial and commercial, the international security situation, the environment, natural disasters and pandemics. New actors have appeared on the world stage. Large developing countries, generally called emerging markets or rising powers, including India, Brazil, Indonesia, and others. Non-state actors, from extremists and terrorist groups with global reach, to banks and corporations, civil society groups and NGOs, and of course the influence of the media, national and international, including the social media, impacting political and even economic, national, and on occasion international decision making, and leading to a global dissemination and exchange of information. Here is, Mr. Vice Chancellor, a slight disagreement with you. Ultimate power, in my view, and therefore responsibility, continues, however, to reside in nation states. And it is their actions which determine the practice and procedures, structures of global governance. This is just my view. There have been over the years, in Europe, they had tried to have Europe, but today there are barbed wire fences on borders. to stop refugees from Syria coming in. So Schengen agreement is under threat. Terrorist attack in Paris has caused a further tightening of Schengen. So even €1 is a question in doubt. You're back to France and Germany and the UK. That's what they're discussing in Brussels today or yesterday. Now I want to get back to my global governance thing. There have been over the years attempts by states or groups of states to change the global order. Whenever there was an apparent shift in global power structures, but most were unsuccessful, as the established powers fought back and retained their positions through their more practiced diplomacies, or even their still considerable military and economic power. These two contrasting forces can be illustrated by referring to the effort by developing countries to take advantage of the seeming shift in power balance in 1973, when the oil-producing countries, OPEC, suddenly decided to raise oil prices, and the UN convened at the request of developing countries a special session on cooperation for development, pushing the idea of development to the forefront. And they called for the declaration of a new international economic order. It started a North-South dialogue. Unfortunately, this the entire effort petered out, not only because of dissensions amongst the developing countries, but because the North-South dialogue became restricted to that between the OPEC and the Western markets. The rest of the developing countries did not, in fact, have the power to push for equitable treatment at that time. There's one particular point I would like to make here, but very briefly, which is, I will come to India's role later on, but India had fought for decolonization when the UN was working on decolonization. India similarly was one of the leading countries in the UN pushing for development. It was under Indian auspices that you had the 1960s declared as a development decade. The adoption of an international development strategy. At the same time, she was looking at disarmament as well, which I think Mr. Sood spoke to you about some time ago. These concepts which came up during the discussion on development are valid today. Equity. You've heard a lot about the issue of equity, both in climate change and today in the WTO negotiations on agriculture in Nairobi. And targets for development assistance, which no longer applies to us, but it does to the other developing countries in the world. And including the Human Development Index, which does matter to us. Mehboob Haq and Amartya Sen were the two who formed the HDI. Just give me a minute. I think I'm putting too much passion into this. let me try and get back to my argument for reform of the international order. Two other areas. One is non-proliferation and one is human rights. In non-proliferation, I will be very brief because my former colleague Rakesh Sood has already spoken to you about it. And it was a negotiation where India tried to challenge the order alone. We were not powerful enough. And he must have told you about the NPT negotiations, where we had to say that, all right, you keep your global order, we will not be a party to it. And we stayed out of the non-proliferation regime. In fact, till today, we only participate on issues where it suits us. It's a very constricted issue, and on the security matters relating to the nuclear issue, we tend to see it as, India tends to see it as a zero-sum game. The second was human rights, and this I found very interesting. We were an independent country when we participated in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had an outstanding representative who did the drafting, who participated in the drafting, called Hansa Mehta. And she was a member of our Constituent Assembly as well. So what happened was that when the UDHR was adopted, several countries abstained. Those of the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, they abstained on the vote. Saudi Arabia abstained on the vote. And so did apartheid South Africa, but that's understandable. But we did not. We even, in fact, have drawn from the UDHR for our own constitution a lot of the principles and a lot of the language, I think. I mean, I dare say this in this particular forum, but I think that we have borrowed language from the UDHR for our constitution. Unfortunately, what tended to happen, which has prevented human rights from becoming a universally accepted concept, has been the, I don't want to sound so anti-Western because I'm not, but it is the West started using human rights as a foreign policy tool to criticize and take action against countries whose regimes or politics they did not approve of, but not those countries who were their allies. This led to a reaction against the UDHR itself as being reflective of a liberal Western culture. In 1993, the Asian countries adopted an Asian Declaration of Human Rights, the Bangkok Declaration. While it reaffirmed commitment to the UDHR, it stressed on the need for respect for sovereignty and the need for objectivity in the application of UDHR. Similarly, you had a problem in 2000. The Organization of Islamic States called a meeting in Cairo, and they had the Cairo Declaration on Islamic Human Rights, where they said countries were free, they didn't say they had to, were free to observe human rights in the context of Sharia law. This is in other words, each country wanted to do this, but within their own cultural context as sovereign decisions, not part of a global order. The problem arose with the practices which came to be associated with the human rights discourse, rather than with human rights principles themselves, leading countries like China to oppose even a reference to human rights as a desirable objective of the global order. As a result, a much more recent effort by the West to introduce the concept of responsibility to protect. I don't know if there is anybody who's doing human rights law here. The R2P is the right of the international community, whichever that is, to intervene in a state if the regime in that state is denying its citizens the basic human rights. And this has caused such objection, and now after Libya, it is the idea, the push has withered away altogether, because I don't want to go into what happened in Libya, but charging Gaddafi with having undermined the human rights of the Libyans, the West invaded, and today it is in a state of complete anarchy. India's stand on the issue of human rights has been on its principles. We have criticized practice, but always emphasized the importance to the principles of human rights, which have got us the attempt to blur practices with principle. Practices, I mean, for example, even a country like Sweden, its human rights department is in their foreign office. For what reason? It should be in their Ministry of Justice or Internal Affairs or wherever. But it is a foreign policy tool. So that is the practice I'm referring to. But to us, the laws that come from the UDHR, the laws that come from our constitution remain, the principles remain inviolable. From these examples of efforts to modify the existing global order and India's role in the efforts, it is clear the objectives of the order and not the basic structures were sought to be reformed, but the practices and decision-making procedures flowing from these structures, as long as the control of the structures remained in the hands of a few states. This is the situation. It needs to also be noted that global power disposition determined which states would do the controlling. As has been mentioned earlier, the spectacular emergence of China as an economic and military powerhouse and the rise of the other large developing countries were amongst the most significant developments. I'm going to rush through this, but I'll leave a copy behind. You can circulate it to anybody who would be interested. What I have done is I've quoted from the reactions of academics from the West, from the established powers, to the increase in power to tweak the outlines of the global order, moving away from the Western Greco-Roman cultural part. And a former national security advisor has said that existing power holders do not share power easily. unless they are forced to by external or internal circumstance and shifts in the balance of power, which is what is happening today. So what is the global situation? An analyst has seen it as a heptagon, seven-sided figure. And you've got the US, the EU and Japan on one side, three. And you have got China, Russia, India and Brazil on the other side. Now if this heptagon is accepted, then there is no question that the US is the dominant country, technologically, economically, militarily, with a global reach, etc. Europe, as I've already mentioned, is too involved with its internal things, and its power projection, military is very weak. Power projection is down. Japan is coming up, but is not tied up now with the rise of China. Russia is considerably weaker than the Soviet Union was and has moved closer economically to China. While China does not match the US in terms of absolute power, it sees itself as a strategic competitor to the US. Self-perception is an extremely important thing because it's backed with an $11 trillion economy, that it's one of the three economies which is higher than 10 trillion. Ours is 2 trillion, 2 point something. They have a growing modernizing military and a stated ambition to fulfill a Chinese dream of becoming a full-fledged developed country in a few decades. In the current crisis, you have got China investing in Europe. It has bought up real estate in the UK. It has invested in Greece, in Portugal, all the so-called 6 countries. China comes to help and is taking control of large sections of these weak economies in Europe. So what you have, and as I said, Russia has moved towards China because of Ukraine and Crimea. So you've got Brazil and India coming up as what are known as swing states. That in any given situation, these two large countries with their potential would swing the decision one way or another. However, my view is that India is not a pure swing state because of its relations with China. The adversarial relationship is because of our border is unsettled. They claim large tracts of our territory. They have military cooperation with Pakistan, including nuclear cooperation, and Pakistan's nuclear program is directly, it's stated policy, it's India-centric. And Rakesh must have mentioned this. So this is, let's say, the sketch of the global situation. If we accept the heptagon, multilateral, the UN tries to continue with a new heptagon trying to settle down to agree. They're not agreeing. Sometimes they just agree in the UN Security Council. But multilaterally, you've got the multilateral organizations. If I see EU as a regional organization, ASEAN as a regional organization, SAARC and so forth. But The Security Council is used to give legitimacy, but nothing is debated there. Everything was discussed outside the UN Security Council till yesterday, where on Syria, they just go to the Security Council to get the legitimate stamp. Which is why we have been demanding a change so that it is more representative of the 21st century. Its membership is more representative of the 21st century than of the mid-20th century. Discussions on international terrorism, IS or Daesh, all outside the UN. It is not involved in the disputes in Asia, South China Sea, East China Sea. It is not involved with any of these. As far as India is concerned, she has recently said, somebody asked her, a journalist, whether they asked the defense minister whether we would intervene militarily with the alliance against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He said only with a UN mandate. Now, whether this was off the cuff or it was a change in policy, because we have not militarily projected beyond our borders except the immediate neighborhood. We do not use our troops. We use it for peacekeeping, but not for peace building, nothing else. Of course, the thing is that we did not go to the UN in 71 for Bangladesh, nor for the IPKF in Sri Lanka, nor for Maldives. This is our immediate neighborhood, and we do this in our interest. So what are I'm about to enter my concluding portion. I've already told you that India has benefited from the existing order. Our growth, economic growth today, our transformation of our society, uncomfortable though it may be for those of us who are around to feel the discomfort. But there's no doubt the push is forward. We've got this from this current stability that this global order has given. Let me make some of my personal points. For a country like India, growing and focused on her own economic and social transformation, a global order based on law is necessary to provide her with the international framework within which she can find security and prosperity. Unless the framework is stable, if you have anarchy, this is not going to benefit our own stability. Secondly, India is and has been giving much importance to currently multilateral and plurilateral groups, as she has to bilateral relations with major powers. This is evident from PM's visits to BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's one group. The G20, recently in Antalya, the SCO, UFA, as well as the UN General Assembly and the Climate Change Summit in Paris, and simultaneously PM has been visiting all the major powers, US, Japan, China, Russia. So, you know, it's a bilateral balanced with the multilateral. A major challenge, as I mentioned, to the current existing order. Where does this come from? And I believe this is from China's ambitions. and indeed some of her actions. As I've already said, the US, as the existing superpower, has been debating internally whether to help China find its place in the world order, amalgamated within the current order, or contain China. As far as India is concerned, China is our neighbor and a major economic partner. India's geopolitical and capabilities position are not those of the US. They are not anywhere near it. We have a tranquil but a continuing border dispute. As I mentioned earlier, we have territorial problems with China. And we have the military cooperation she has with Pakistan, which is targeted at us, at our heartland. However, what is it that India has been doing? At the multilateral and plurilateral levels, we cooperate with China on climate change, on trade, on finance. Chinese yuan becomes a part of the SDR, and we say, good idea, you need to change the decision making at the global level as other countries become powerful. But on security issues, we do not support China's stand. Now, therefore, we do not support China's proposal for a one belt, one road, for example, because that's China's ambition. It links China to the rest of the world, not the rest of the world to each other. At the same time, India shares liberal values with the West. The values of democracy, pluralism, and the rule of law. However, we don't agree with the means and approach of the US and the Western countries in seeking to resolve problems of international peace and security. India's point has been, we are averse to intervention. We prefer that you start with engagement and dialogue and recourse to mediation rather than military action. Since we have been under a sanctions program ourselves for our nuclear explosion of 1974 for 30 years, we do not believe that it is a useful means to apply punitive sanctions which affect ordinary people as they did in Iraq or indeed Iran. So, this is our dilemma. If China decides or wishes to try to reorient the global order to suit its interests, just as the United States did. It's trying to do this in the law of the sea, for example. And if China's power grows, as it inevitably will, and it will face off with the established powers who will resist it, is India then faced with this binary choice of siding with one or siding with the other? In my view, the issue is one of, given India's position, of following the policy of strategic autonomy or even non-alignment, so that our national interests, the economic where they are, the social values which we have, and the political and security interests where they are, and use this, and this would need a lot of deft diplomacy. And to go back to what I said right at the beginning, the ability to form specific alliances so as to prepare for perhaps intersectoral trade-offs between trade and climate change. You do take one position or the other. I mean, this has to be worked out. But India's core national interests need to be kept as the base. As a liberal and pluralistic developing country, India's multilateral diplomacy should be able to use her growing economic strength to achieve her objectives. Thank you. I'm sorry, it's been in my 45 minutes, but I think we started a bit.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that wonderful lecture and outlining what it really means, what global governance really means, and outlining what India's national interest is, and how, at the end of the day, it is India's national interest, which is what is most important. Having said that, we would now like to open the floor to a few question and answers for about 15-20 minutes.
Ma'am, considering our policy in terms of, say, Kashmir has been of complete non-intervention from the United States, and we say that it can only be resolved bilaterally, and that is obviously a policy which, at least till now, is not having the best desirable results, considering the situation is Kashmir is not what ideally it should be. So do you think that India needs to change its stance in the aspect of as to what our policy has been in terms of what sort of dialogue we have in the United Nations with regards to Kashmir?
Are you suggesting that we ask the UN to solve the Kashmir problem?
No, so Pakistan says that Kashmir problem is something which India needs to UN General Assembly and UN Security Council needs to talk about it and take measures on it.
Yeah, and do what? So they talk about it. We took the issue of when Pakistan in 1947 sent their troops, irregulars, into Kashmir. We took the issue of aggression by Pakistan, that was the subject, to the UN. The political power disposition at that stage in the UN. What I've been trying to convey to you, clearly I've not done it very successfully, is that power determines. There's no right or wrong, there's no morals, there are no ethics. It is power. The power disposition at that stage, it was just after our independence. The Americans did whatever the British told them about the subcontinent, because they were supposed to be the experts. And the British felt you had to keep Russia at bay. The Cold War was starting, and Pakistan was more reliable than India, because the Congress Party was not seen with kind eyes by the then British government. So the completely nothing to do with Kashmir. It is their perception of their national interest which made the UN make it in the issue of Kashmir. And then they had a ceasefire, withdrawal of troops. And Pakistan had to withdraw its troops. We had to withdraw our troops, and then you would have a plebiscite. They never withdrew our troops, their troops. We did not. So what is Pakistan talking about? The issue of going to the UN, I think we learned a real major lesson. We were less than a year old or 2 years or whatever. The issue really is that where it concerns our immediate neighbors, we do not trust international power politics. So the UN is out, which is why in 1971, Mrs. Indira Gandhi went to around the world seeking help for our refugee problems and the crisis in Bangladesh. Then the Pakistanis made the silly mistake of attacking us in our western airfields, and the Bangladesh war started. We didn't go to the UN. We didn't say there's genocide going on here, human rights violations going on here. Nothing. Why? So the issue is we're coming back to what our stand is vis-a-vis the UN and international power. It has taken us, and it's still not, I don't think we have learned completely, but we are much better off today than we were in 1947 and even in 71, where we are not conscious of the power of power, what global power means. Going to the United Nations with our territory, our citizens, is not something which any Indian government will accept. Can accept. Would you accept?
Oh, ma'am, if I may follow up on that.
Ma'am, I have a with the retirement of Ban Ki-moon, there is a demand of having a lady Secretary General. There is a demand.
Yeah, well, frankly, I don't know. We have a lot of young women here. You are either a lawyer or you're not. It doesn't matter if you're a male lawyer or a female lawyer. You're a good lawyer or a bad one. You're a good diplomat or a bad diplomat.
Right.
You're a good leader or a bad leader. I frankly don't see that gender will determine. It's the individual and the individual's experience. Of course, the experience will come with her gender.
No, ma'am, with all these running years, only male people, they have become Secretary General.
Not because they've kept women out. You've not
No,
had
that's a
how
demand,
many foreign ministers?
So ask her.
How many foreign ministers in the world are women? How many prime ministers in the world are women? It's changing. It's changing as women are getting access to education. They are getting ambitious. They are succeeding in, first of all, countries have to become democratic. I mean, the United States has not had a president who is a woman. And they've been democratic for 300 years.
This time, there's a good chance.
There's still a good chance. But she has to stand, not as a woman, but she has to stand as a person. I really think it is a question of whether she might be a disastrous president of the United States. I don't know. She might be another George Bush. I mean, I don't say that George Bush was a bad US president because he was a man.
I have a question. Ma'am, you mentioned something with regards to how the Security Council should become more representative in today's life. So, just a quick question. The functioning of the Security Council or its efficacy, wouldn't that be based on one, whether the countries that comprise, that are members of the council are militarily ready to react to any kind of threat to international peace and security, and second, that they are willing to reach some kind of consensus in light of that threat. So, including more countries for something as niche as the Security Council, would that not lead to more delay in decision making because of greater power pulls in different directions rather than convergence And also India and other developing countries, if they do gain membership, permanent membership of the Security Council, are they still militarily equally ready as compared to the permanent members today?
You've got several questions there actually, and that's not going to be a brief answer. I think. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Let me try and answer what I can. One is India's policies are known. They are not unknown in the United Nations. We do not favor a military solution to an international crisis. Prevention, discussion, we've been suggesting for West Asia discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And if Pranav had permitted me, I would have talked about West Asia rather than multilateral diplomacy, which is my area of interest. India's role would be to promote the idea that it is not military solutions that are going to get you anywhere, which is what is the accepted, what you just said. That is accepted convention. Why? Who said that you have to have the ability to go and tell somebody that if you don't do this, we will come and hit you? This is something where the mindset has to change. So, our argument in becoming a member of the UN Security Council is that we will bring a different perspective. And it's not a question of taking longer, it's a question of credibility of the Security Council. Today, it is what I have said is not unknown. You have the powers in the West, and you have the power of China and Russia. They will veto what these people are pushing, or these people will veto what these are pushing. So why should anybody want to go there? They will make allies and go and get. The credibility is not there. So you have to build up the credibility by getting in people who are swing states, which I mentioned right at the end. Brazil, India, maybe you get other countries. Yes.
So I have a question for you. I would just like your personal views on this. So when you spoke to us about how it ultimately depends on the powers of the nation, right? And it's very power specific. It's not very equitable. And so power is in today's international situation in conflict with the whole idea of sovereignty, right? So what the UN Charter states that we will abide by sovereignty. So how far do you think that the nations in power can actually abide by this principle of sovereignty that Article 2 talks about? Because we always see gross violations of territorial sovereignty of nations, and not much is being done about that as well.
No, but this is your lawyer, or you're planning to be a lawyer. This is a legal basis, is that you can defend yourself. But aggression, if it is established, is to be dealt with by Chapter 6 and 7. In the UN Security Council, if it was functioning, would have gone to 6 economic measures, dialogue, whatever, or Chapter 7 military force. What we are trying to do is to say Chapter 7 should be very low in priority. You use military force. Keep the economic and the persuasion, try and find a solution, in between. Of course, otherwise your thing is why have laws at all? Even in a country there's so much crime. So you have crime, you accept there's crime. People will violate laws. Then you catch them and put them away.
I have a question.
I'll finish with this, Pranav.
Sure.
Okay.
Ma'am, two final questions.
Okay, I think you kind of give it away a part of your views on this question, but I think I'd like to hear more of this. It's a two-part question. There are two parts to the
Could you
question.
raise your voice?
There are two parts to my question. One is if we look at how our present government has come into power and the way it's been behaving with our neighbors, choosing to interact with our neighbors not just through the Foreign Office or at least involving our security establishment in the way we deal with our Foreign Office. I think that's one way we are trying to aggressively project our power around our neighborhood. So there is also this local demand or demand within our community, especially amongst the youth, that we must project our power in a more aggressive manner. Now, I just heard you say that we are also trying to promote an alternative viewpoint, but then we started off on the premise that power matters a lot. So how do we reconcile this? Can I hear your views on whether we should continue to aggressively promote our or project our power, especially in our neighborhood, yet at the same time go around on an international venue and try and say that no, it's not a military solution.
I don't understand this project your power aggressively. You don't have to do it aggressively, only bullies do it aggressively. I don't understand that. I mean, if that's what the young people feel, then I think it's fortunate they are not in power. Frankly, it is a bully. We have been bullied for many, many years, even after independence, when we were being fed by foreign food and our people were dying of starvation. We were dependent on others and they could speak to us like that. Did we like it? And we are a big country, an old civilization. Why should a small country, certainly all the countries who are our neighbors are smaller than us, appreciate, you want ultimately stable relations, if not good relations with your neighbors. How can you get good relations if you are aggressive? I mean, it's common sense, it's not even law, it's just common sense. The other is, if you apply the same outside, at a multilateral level. I mentioned the word deft, and it's very difficult for a democracy to be deft because of the media, because of interest groups, NGOs, putting pressure on the government, ultimately the votes. So what kind of stand should the government take? Because ultimately, as I said, the responsibility is theirs. So that they will win or lose the next election. You can't expect anybody, any democracy, to do that. But you have to then choose what position that you will take in a multilateral situation. Having identified what your core interest is, if your core interest you have defined, which you have, as the economic and social transformation of our society towards prosperity, for which you need stability, you need a quiet periphery, etc., etc. If you want a quiet periphery, you don't want aggressive bullying. If you want stability, you don't want to go around, you want to give time to the country to concentrate on what's going on here, on all our billion mutinies, all the interest groups fighting each other, the political parties, everybody's fighting everybody. You've got to stabilize this and see that you move, that the people as a whole will move in whichever direction they want. They want to go right, left, up, down, God knows where they want to go. But they have to decide. So you have to give them a climate in which they can decide. And as I was telling, I think, Pranav and his friends yesterday, that we're only 67 years old as a nation state. As a nation we are much older, but as a nation state we're only 67 years old. Let us at least be 100. 100 years of democracy, maybe like the United States, 300 years of democracy. You know, so for our society also to evolve and find where we are. All right, everybody, thank you very much. It has been great pleasure. I really treasure this thing. I'm sorry I took quite long, but we did start a little late. And